Okay, let me introduce our first feature, who's going to be talking about Samuel Johnson. Marylee Stephenson has loved Samuel Johnson since she was 14 and ran across some excerpts of Boswell's Life of Johnson. Oh, that's when she started to love him, when she ran across some excerpts from Boswell's Life of Johnson in her older sister's English literature textbook. Over these many years, she has built up a substantial collection of Johnsonians and has given talks and even a continuing studies class about Johnson. But most importantly, she reads bits and pieces of his works nearly daily and finds that there is always something to learn, to enjoy, to be comforted by, and even to laugh with. Johnson is a friend. Okay, great. Marylee, come on up.
Candace has suggested that I hold it, so I'll just see. How does that work? Does that work all right? Okay. When people can't hear you, then you may say, "Can you hear me back there?" And then they can't say anything because they don't hear you back there. So let's just try. I'm going to try this, but again, I think mostly I can be heard. That's better like that. It's extremely unidirectional, so I'll just see. Okay. So Samuel Johnson, you see the picture below. He lived from 1709 to 1784. And this was the days when it was, this thing also, it dies.
Is it that?
Yeah. I think we'll do that. Can you hear me okay? And go from there, okay? Okay. All right. So this was a time when there was a beginning to be a sort of shift in the rigid class structure of England. And he was able to be, as an intellectual or as a conversationalist, as a writer, you could associate with the very top of society. And this is a time, if you think of Joshua Reynolds, you think of Gainsborough, you think of Dryden Pope, if you know those kind of people. I only know some of them peripherally. But you could then associate much more widely than, for instance, in Victorian times afterwards, where the class structure was very rigid. Or previously, I mean, I don't know that much about previous times. And so I ran across him, and he, at one level, you would see him as what was referred to as a Grub Street writer, a hack writer, or would think of it these days as a freelance writer. He had to live by his writing, and it was not an easy thing. He was himself, his father owned a sort of bookshop in the town of Lichfield in England, so they're very modest background. And when he was born, his mother was, I think, already in her 40s. It was a difficult birth. Probably he had some oxygen starvation. He always was physically very ungainly. And he was put out to a wet nurse who was tubercular. He got in scrofula, which was tuberculosis of the lymph glands. So and it also damaged his sight, and his hearing was never good. So this man lived with a lifetime of difficult health problems and everything, and at the same time, a phenomenal mind that was evident from the very beginning. And he tried to make his way as a teacher and didn't make it. He was so sort of strange, like he had a lot of twitches, and he was a big, ungainly man. He married at about 26, 23. You've got the timeline to a woman 20-some years older than him. And what he referred to, he said it was a love match from the beginning, but they did not spend a lot of time together. He went to London like you would do, right? You go to London so that you can hope you can make a living, you can sell a few of your pieces, you know, that kind of thing. Not unlike struggling artists and writers today, really. And so his first writing, he wrote to what's called the Gentleman's Magazine. It wouldn't have been like the Macleans of the day, you know, but there was, again, this you could be a star on an intellectual basis there. You know, you didn't have to be a rock star. You could eventually become very well known and very well thought of. And so he began to have pieces here, there, and everywhere. He's most known probably for his dictionary. So I wanted you to see this. because I think it's every man's press. It's Barnes & Noble did this. And it's a reproduction of what it looked like, right? And he himself, in that mind, it took him 9 years, but in his mind there's over 100,000 words. And he had the definitions, a number of definitions, and then largely out of his memory, but also they didn't have the internet in those days, right? He would look at it from his own collection. He would have examples of the use of it. And just to think of that alone, you know, and for 300 pounds, some of the booksellers who also were publishers got money together, and the idea was, again, to shape and to stabilize the English language. You know, it's just unbelievable work. And he also would have they would have periodicals, like he had one, the Rambler, the Idler, the Adventurer. So for about 2 years, in each case, he would write essays, and each week you would read them, and people would talk about them, and they'd talk about them in the coffee houses and in the taverns. And they were both philosophical, and I'll read little bits of them, sort of moral tales to some degree. He also wrote a play that was not successful. His school partner from the same town was David Garrick, if you know him as the actor, right, who went to London and became phenomenally successful. He tried to produce Johnson's play. It ran nine shows, so he got a little royalty. He also wrote that they had what were then sort of Oriental tales, where people would, you know, travelers would imagine there were travelers, and you would write sort of fantasy tales with figures from afar, and this is one of them. It was his Rasselas, it was called, and this book, this is 1817. You can buy these, actually, they're not uncommon, they're not bad. But this, it just, to me, it's just amazing and part of collecting, because like, I do have like an entire wall like that of Johnsonian stuff and stuff related to it. So that was some of his production. And then